Okay, I think we'll get started. I'd like to welcome everyone. Thank you for attending today. I'm Maggie Sokolik. I'm the Director of College Writing Programs, and we welcome you to our annual Berkeley Writers at Work. While this year's event may not look like previous years, it promises to be as engaging and informative as always. It is my special pleasure first to introduce our interviewer, John Levine, a lecturer in college writing programs, coordinator of this series, and a respected local playwright. He's always an excellent interviewer, but this is especially so today when he will interview our guest, also a playwright, Philip Kan Gotanda, professor of theater, dance, and performance studies. Over the last 4 decades, Professor Gotonda has been a major influence in broadening our definition of American theater. He is a creator of several Asian American themed works and has been instrumental in bringing stories of Asians in the U.S. to mainstream American theater, as well as to theater in Europe and Asia. Professor Gotonda has investigated the Japanese American family, writing a cycle of works in theater, film, song, and opera that chronicle Japanese America from the early 1900s to the present. Professor Gotonda has an enviable resume. He holds a law degree from Hastings College of Law. He studied pottery in Japan with the late Hiroshi Seto. He has directed 3 films, Life Tastes Good, Drinking Tea, and The Kiss, all which presented at the Sundance Film Festival. A CD of Professor Gotonda performing his original songs in a 1979 concert with violinist D.H. Wong is available at East Wind Books in Berkeley. They're open. Please visit them. And especially of interest to me as an avid opera fan, his opera, Both Eyes Open, with composer Max Duikers, is scheduled to premiere later next year in San Francisco. We're all crossing our fingers on that. Mr. Gotonda is the recipient of a Guggenheim as well as other honors and awards. So please welcome John Levine and Philip Kan Gotanda with some applause that only you will hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. I am John Levine, and I want to welcome everyone to our first virtual Berkeley Writers at Work. This year marks our 24th year in the series. I just want to let you know that our past interviews are archived on the College Writing Program's website at writing.berkeley.edu, as will this interview be archived as well. Just a little bit about the series. The focus of Berkeley Writers at Work is inviting UC Berkeley faculty to reflect on and talk about their writing process. We talk a lot about the things that we've written and we talk about content, but it's not often that we get to talk about how it actually happens and actually think about how it happens. And that's what we'll talk about today with playwright, filmmaker, opera librettist, musician, pottery maker, Philip Kan Gotanda. The format is we'll talk for about 45 minutes and then allow time for questions from the audience, which you can submit using the chat function in Zoom. I will read them aloud. And to kick things off, we are going to enjoy an excerpt from Philip's opera, Both Eyes Open.
this land now?
Philip, tell us a little bit about what we just saw.
Well, first off, thank you for having me, Maggie, and John, and the writers at work, folks here. The opera it's a new music opera. It's called Both Eyes Open, and it's about, based on a true story of a young man who, while incarcerated, this is during World War II, as a Japanese American, incarcerated in a camp in Arkansas, sneaked out and laid down on railroad tracks and committed suicide. And I came across a rather graphic photograph of that. And that was the kind of core of the story. And it kind of takes that moment and makes it a little more mythical. And he flashes back in time and he flashes forward in time until that exact moment again is relived. And we ask whether he lived or died, or in fact, he lives on as an idea, or he died as an idea. And that expresses more of kind of the contemporary social justice, examines that in relationship to a past event and what's going on now. So it's written by the composers Max Dykers, that was Kevin Chan, Kalyan Ung, and John Dykers, a renowned tenor opera singer, and musicians from Paul Drescher Ensemble. It's Joel Devel and Marge Mutru. And hopefully later next year, we have our world premiere.
So I didn't realize that Jinzo Matsumoto was an actual person. This is his story. What I'm curious about is how much research did you do? How much creative license did you do in shaping this piece of work?
I've written a great deal about the Japanese American internment, incarceration during World War II. So for me, I've written about it. I've researched it. I've done interviews over the years. So at this time, it was important for me, if I were going to go back to this topic, to find a new vantage point, a new way of looking at the material, to keep it relevant and timely. And so for me, the idea was, it really allows my mind just to go anywhere. I'm not beholden to anything, anyone, and even history. I wanted this to almost be kind of like a psychological, soulful, as it were, action painting almost. And that allowed me to free up and approach the material again in a different way, hopefully, allowing all the contemporary influences to be part of that telling. So I take great license, and I own it all for whatever anyone thinks about how I've addressed this particular historical moment.
When you knew you wanted to write about this story, did you immediately know it was going to be an opera? Did you consider a play? Did you consider a film? How did you know this was going to be an opera?
This is part of a kind of a bigger way I approach, or methodology I approach writing. I find at different moments, maybe this is true with you too, John, where you sort of been working with an aesthetic, with a way of writing that it becomes too familiar. You know it well enough that, in fact, you don't think about it, and it becomes almost kind of, for me, a kind of imprisonment of which you are so familiar with your aesthetic and writing style and how to tap into it, that you need to fracture it and break it open and kind of collaborate with other people. And this opera, new music opera, was an attempt at that, where I thought, boy, I should just, if I'm going to write about something I've written about for 40 years, I need to collaborate. I need to try something very different to crack open whatever aesthetic I have. And so that's why I chose new music opera. And also I heard about John Dykers, who's a well-known tenor opera singer. In fact, we talked a little about John Adams. He played, of all people, John Dykers played Mao in Nixon in China.
Oh.
Talk about being politically incorrect. And also, I heard that John Dikers was doing this concert south of Market, and I had followed him as he used to work with Rindy Eckert and a couple other local people. I can't think of the group, but they used to put on shows that were visually kind of way ahead of their time in terms of slides and projections using opera singers, John Dikers and Rindy Eckert. And so I said to my wife, Diane, let's go see John. So we went to south of Market in this little small cubby hole. And John came out and started singing. I was sitting about 5 feet from him. And I just said, man, this is such an amazing experience. This opera singer with this gorgeous voice sitting 5 feet away from me, singing this experimental opera. And it kind of made me go like, I have to work with him, you know? So afterwards I went up to him and chatted, and down the road, I tapped him and he said, yes, let's try something. And so that's how John became involved. That's why I chose this medium and how I came to this particular story with John.
So you were collaborating from the outset. It wasn't as though you had the story all figured out and you went to John and said, set this to music. The two of you actually truly collaborated every step of the way?
Yes, in fact, but this is the great thing about working with a small group that's very generous. Again, as an artist, I changed the story, the actual story, after Max Dykers had written the score, and after we had even workshopped it around the country. I changed the story 3 times, and because I couldn't feel it, you know, that I had that luxury, and so they said, let's just change it. So it started off initially based on this fellow who used to write it, who used to call into radio shows and say he was from the future. This is true. But everyone knew he was a fake, but he was so good at it that people believed him. Started there, then it went to about a Japanese American farmer who kind of introduced growing potatoes pre-depression and became this potato king in the San Joaquin Valley. Then it shifted from there finally to the story, Both Eyes Open. And all through that, I was collaborating with everybody. And though they allowed me the luxury and also to write anything I wanted to write. So that's very much a luxury.
And is that pretty typical of your work? You may be working on whether it's a play, a film, a project, that you will shift the story, that you're working on one story and then it may shift 3, 4 times?
Yes, much to the chagrin of people who have commissioned me, you know, especially when I was working with theaters, it got to the point where if they commissioned me, I would say, it's probably one of these 3 ideas, you know, and then with the caveat that it may be none of these and something else totally different. So that I really let them know ahead of time that I start out somewhere, but you can never tell where it goes. And I'm not about to like limit the flow of that by trying to fit into something that's preordained. And because I know how I work, and they've always been happy to do it. Even all my opera folks in Both Eyes Open have been very generous that way.
So are you, I assume you are, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. Are you comfortable with that process? Is there anxiety when you're on your second version of the story and then you have to shift from the potato farmer to Jinzo Matsumoto? Or do you just let it flow? Do you know that this is just the way that you work?
I know it's the way I work, but I'm very anxious about it. I would rather that I did one thing, and after they've written music, and we've done one act, and Max has scored this, and we've sung it in front of folks, that it would stay the same. But I also know that I just at some moments can't. It's made me very bad in terms of being able to do works like in Hollywood or anything along those lines, because I know my work, kind of the way I work and write. So I get terribly anxious about it, and that's the way I work.
Since you mentioned Hollywood, let's talk a little bit about your films. So film is a little bit of a different medium in that you may not have that wide a berth to change and to pivot. I know a lot of the films that you've worked on have been independent. You've directed some of them. Are there more constraints? Is it different then? Do you have to lock into your story more securely than you do with theater, for example?
You know, you do. And I had several experiences, kind of Hollywood stories that kind of ended dramatically and not well for me, where I was hired, you know, to write something and I just couldn't write it. You know, I couldn't do it the way it was supposed to be written. One of them was I was hired by, actually, I always worked in areas that acknowledged the themes that I explore. And I was working with, there used to be this kind of PBS series called Great, I forget what it was, but they wanted to do a 3-part series about the Japanese, when they first kind of brought in, and the locomotive, the whole automobile industry was kind of, you know, tipped over when all the Japanese cars invaded, and there was a great deal of anti-Japanese sentiment. I was supposed to do a 3-part series, and I said, I can do it, I can do it, I can do it. This is my wheelhouse. And it got to the point where finally I did something which I'd seen in movies, and that is I holed up in a hotel. And I was in LA, so I went to the New Otani Hotel because I'd seen this in the movies, right? It always works. Checked into the hotel, and I told my wife, I ain't leaving till I get this done. And so after about 4 days of, like, you know, the things were actually piled up, all my food, and I hadn't written it. And I said, man, I am defeated. I have to go back to them and tell them, I'm sorry, I can't do it. And that was the point where I decided, I had one more experience where I just couldn't, I wrote it and they didn't do it. And I thought, this is my best shot, you know, that I decided I have to kind of do films the way I do my plays. And so I basically started making them all on my own, using people I know and bringing them all up to the Bay Area. And, you know, luckily I had a group of actors already that I knew and were willing to kind of forego on something and come up here and work. And also the Bay Area, at least at the time I was making the films, is a great scene for independent filmmaking, certainly documentaries. But there are people, you know, camera persons available here. So it was to make films, which was the first love. I just decided I'm going to do it myself. I'd never done it before, and just started working with people and figured it out. And I only made 3 films of my own that I wrote, produced, and directed. The Kiss, Drinking Tea, and then the feature. I ended with the feature, Life Tastes Good. And they're all done totally independently, with nobody coming in at all and saying anything. And we were able to, you know, sell the film, went to Sundance, but it also is enormously taxing to work totally independent of Hollywood, you know, where you don't have any pre-sales or anything like that guaranteed. But it's, again, the way I work. So that's the way I made the films.
So you mentioned Hollywood, you mentioned PBS as well, and I want to ask you about a film that I saw many years ago, which was one of my first introductions to your work, was The Wash, which was on American Playhouse.
Yeah.
I have a lot of questions about that, but could you talk a little bit about how that came to PBS and I know you were the screenwriter, there was another director. Can you talk a little bit about that?
That was an instance where I wrote a play that was very much a kind of Japanese American, Asian American family story. And that as it was being produced around the country, it began to draw interest, which was rather unusual because at that time in particular, the idea of doing a film on a very Japanese American family was was unheard of. And there was a director, Michael Uno, who took a lot of interest in it and also was working with PBS. And he took it to them. And they said, well, this looks really good. We brought in a producer, Calvin Skaggs, and I was brought on as the screenwriter. And that's how that all happened. And then it was made, and it did quite well. It was quite a kind of groundbreaker for the type of film it was. And it got a theatrical release also. So it was, very much ahead of its time. And that's how that got done.
And in terms of film, it sounds like that had a happy ending. That was a good process for you.
that was a good process up to the point where I wanted to actually, I realized if I'm going to do this again, as much as I appreciated Michael Uno and the producer Calvin Skaggs, I wanted to do it myself. So it at least inspired me to think this was a good experience, but I have to do this myself next time, which was the case.
So about The Wash, the play and the film, it centers, for those who haven't seen it, the main characters are older. You wrote it when you were a younger man.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about how you enter, well, first of all, a number of your plays actually are about older characters. Johan comes to mind. After the war, there are a number of characters, that may not be your age. So do you find yourself and I know that, a big theme that you're drawn to is Japanese internment, which happens to fall into these storylines. But I'm curious about your writing outside of your own experience, be it age, be it ethnicity, be it experience. I'm not sure what my question is, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, in terms of The Wash and Johan, in which the characters are both, in both of those plays in their 60s to late 60s, mid 60s to late 60s, I just have always been attracted to stories that have older characters. I'm not even sure why, because The Wash was, I think, originally written when I was in my early 30s, I think, and the characters are in their mid 60s. And again, I have no idea why I'm drawn to that, but one of the things I've done all my life is that, I've listened to his voice and I've nurtured my ability to hear that voice, and whatever it gives me, I write. And it isn't necessarily kind of what I would have thought, as in the case of older characters. When I was younger, a lot of female lead characters that have come out of me, though I come from a lot of all boys in my family and extended family, for some reason, I just have things come out of me that take me places that aren't necessarily who I am at that moment. Though I would kind of argue that almost everything is drawn from this kind of locus. And I don't know how you write, John, but there literally is a kind of a core of myself that I know is me. It's every experience I've had, and also what I feed into it. I continually feed it, and that becomes the pool from whence all my stories come. So even though it may not be explicitly Asian American, Japanese American, I do know that it's as if that's like one of the houses I come out of as you step out into the world and begin to kind of like just get new words, new vocabulary, new experiences, and they all go back into that. And I always kind of use that as the starting point, seed. And so whatever that means in response to your question, whatever the question was, I think we met in the middle somewhere.
I think we did. Fair enough. Let's talk a little bit about your actual process. Let's talk nuts and bolts. How did you come to writing? Did you always want to be a writer?
No. In fact, early on, I was much more interested in music, and I spent a good 10 years from like the time I was about 14 up to like 24 or so, really trying to make it as a singer-songwriter. I was at the time kind of really enamored of people like, you'll know them, Jackson Browne, or people like that, so kind of singer-songwriters, or Bob Dylan. He's always been, of late, I don't recognize him, but early in his career, I was a big avid follower of him. I wanted to be a singer-songwriter. I did that after I graduated from school. I went to LA. I was kind of hawking my songs. I was hawking them in San Francisco. And literally, I was getting really discouraged. I was doing everything I thought I was supposed to do. I'd even like we have part-time jobs. I'd work at Elektra Records, and or Asylum Records or Elektra. And I'd sit at the front desk because that's what I requested for part-time work. And I would go through their Rolodexes, which people don't know what they are anymore. And they'd have all the private phones and addresses of all the rock stars, and I did the whole thing of like, but I'm going to get these addresses. I'm going to send them my video cassettes, and then of course they'll call me back, and that never happened. And so finally, and this is a true story, I was playing up in San Francisco at an open mic, right in North Beach. And the thing I didn't add was that all my songs, the original songs, were about being Asian American and Japanese American. So if you can imagine, in the kind of early to mid 70s, that actually wasn't a big selling, theme. And so, but I persisted, and I was singing in North Beach at an open mic. No one was listening. And then again, this is a true story. A stripper came in from next door and started dancing to my music. She kind of walked in. I remember she had a chainmail outfit with nothing on underneath, and kind of swayed up to the front of the stage as I was singing my Yellow Soul out, and she began dancing, and everyone started clapping and paying attention, as it were, to the rhythm of my song about my Yellow Soul torches. And I really looked out on that at that moment and said, boy, this is not good. This is not good for a lifestyle. And that's when I decided I'm going to go to law school. And that directed me to law school. I'm going to arrive at the final moment yet. And in law school, I couldn't write songs. So I started to write a musical. And I had no contact with theater. I actively did not like musicals. And so, but I strung together a bunch of songs. So after I graduated from law school and was studying for the bar, I got a phone call from a fellow at a small theater in LA called East West Players, a fellow named Mako. And he said, I came across your songs for this musical and we want to do them. We want to do this as a musical. And I literally thought, wow, the world has been saying no to me for so long. This is a moment where it's actually saying yes to me. It's not what I intended or thought my path would be, but I thought, you know what, I got my law degree. I don't know if I need to practice. So I said, I'm coming down and let's do this. So I just packed up my Datsun 510 station wagon. I think used to be a popular car with all my stuff. I decided to not take the bar, and I drove to LA, and I played in the band on stage and kind of watched what theater was from the bandstand, and literally I had no contact with theater, and again, no interest up to that point. So it was just totally new to me watching this going on. The musical did reasonably well. I learned a whole bunch, and they asked me to write another one. And so I wrote another one with less music, and that did reasonably well. I watched and was trying to figure it out. And then I wrote one with no music, and that did well, all in small theaters. And so from that point on, I was given this career that was unexpected in a medium also that I initially did not like. And it has afforded me a journey that allowed me to get back to films and music as I became more successful in theater. But that's how I got into it,
I've heard a lot of origin stories. That is unique, absolutely. So from playing your guitar in coffee houses, a stripper comes in and that leads you to law school, and then that leads you into writing musicals and then into writing plays. Wow. Wow, that's but does it all make sense looking back at it now? Does it all make sense? You couldn't have gone right into writing plays. You needed to take those steps.
I most definitely think I needed to go through those steps to write theater, because again, I had no interest in theater. So it had to be something that kind of like pushed me along and pulled me along in that area, so that I was able to kind of use whatever native talents I had, and they gradually were kind of stewarded and pulled along this other direction. And then again, this is that thing where I tell my students, like, you can never tell when the world's going to say yes to you, because for the most part, I tell my students involved in the arts and artists, the world's going to say no to you continuously, and that whatever you have that drives you, whatever that interest is, has to be able to kind of both understand why that no is happening and you measure your talent against that, as well as the understanding that you just have to keep driving ahead, and that if all is good in the universe, whatever you're saying syncs up with the interest in the public, and that you meet them, and that it allows you to continue to kind of have a story told through that. And if it says yes to you, you know, you have to make a decision whether you're going to go down that path. And for me, I was fortunate enough that after much much saying no to me, the world said yes in a small little window, and I followed it, and it's given me this journey to this moment right now here with you, John. It's sort of like at UC Berkeley, which I would have never dreamt of either.
So you mentioned working with your students, and I do want to talk about that a little bit later, but people said yes to you, and well-deserved. But how did you, when people said no, I mean, once you were on your journey in theater, did you face no again, or was it yes all the way? Was it green lights all the way? So I guess my question is, how do you deal with the adversity, or how did you deal with the adversity of no? How did you find your path? Because it's easy to look back at your path now, but on that journey, and again, how do you tell your students to deal with that, to persist?
Well, in terms of my own story, I do know it had to do with having a story and an interest that also dovetailed with a historical moment. You know, I began writing about being Asian American and Japanese American, all because of the whole movement that was emerging from the late 60s, mid 60s on, where there was the Asian American movement, the Black movement, the Chicano movement, gay lesbian movement. They were all emergent. And so it just so happened that I was writing stories about, well, the first thing is I didn't know how to articulate my story. I mean, you'll remember this moment, but there used to be a time when if I were writing, I could not have a character that looked like this, that had this body, this face, with this particular history. I mean, seriously, you couldn't write stories like that because no one would know what to do with it. And you yourself had already internalized so much that I remember, I think it was, well, my agent definitely said to me at that time, you know, you got to write stories. Why do you keep writing about stories with Asian Americans? Well, when I first started, you know, I didn't know what to write about. The movement, the social movement was emergent. And it so happened that I began to sort of understand that whatever this kind of political thing that was happening, it was affording me a chance finally to tell my own story, to actually have a voice that could feature characters that looked like me, that acted like me, that I could tap into this whole kind of historical, psychological world, family world, and that story coming out of me felt true and authentic. And two, the world, because of the social movement, was beginning to listen. And so my first entree was in through these kind of very ethnic specific theaters that were kind of cropping up around the country. So my first experiences were with Asian American theater companies in San Francisco, LA, New York, Seattle. Again, small fledgling theaters that were born out of, quote, the movement. And I happened to be with the Asian American movement, you know, part of the cultural movement. All the movements had these kind of different branches, and the Chicano movement had a lot of poster art, and ultimately they also had emergent this whole Luis Valdez movement that he sort of started out of the back of a flatbed truck, doing these kind of agitprop plays during the whole rape strikes that they were having. And in the same sense, for the Asian Americans, they began doing plays about the incarceration of Japanese Americans, Angel Island. And so that afforded me an entree into writing stories, and they would get done. It so happened that when I was working with many of the theater companies, the Asian American ones, everyone wanted to be in front of the camera. Everyone wanted to be an actor. but I happen to want to write stories. So literally everything I wrote went up, good, bad, or ugly. I mean, and it afforded me a chance also to work on the craft, also work with artists of like mind, so that there was a shorthand. And it also allowed me to be able to kind of invent with other people of like mind, a kind of a theatrical form that had an aesthetic that was also very much kind of influenced and informed by a social movement, a political movement. And it's because of that that I was afforded kind of this opportunity to walk through this door with many other artists and finally have a voice. And from then, it mainstream theater, quote, mainstream theater took an interest in these works, and I began to work outside of just the, not just the Asian American theater companies. So there, locally, it was like Berkeley Rep, Eureka Theater took an interest in what I was doing. And so I also began to work with these other theater companies. And then that was all part of, I worked, David Henry Wong was doing the same thing. We worked together. In fact, the music that we recorded is actually David Henry Wong and myself. We had a band early on and we used to perform around. I'd like these, I used to perform at these demonstrations and just, at Asian American gatherings. But there are other artists that were kind of in film, in music, and in theater that were all kind of emergent at the same time. And I was able to be a part of that. And it gradually moved over to the mainstream, kind of at the same time. I remember for a while I was in law school, I used to work at a legal aid in North Beach, Chinatown. And a fellow who was working right down the hall as a kind of worker was Wayne Wang. And Wayne Wang went on to do like the first, quote, Asian American film with Chan is Missing, that used a lot of Asian American theater company actors, San Francisco's Chinatown area. And he, went on eventually to do Joy Luck Club and all these other films. But there were other people doing things at the same time that all were part of that emergent scene. And so, yes, I was afforded this opportunity because I was in a particular place at a particular time. That is not to say that it was easy, because along with that, again, there was a lot of, resistance to this idea of having Asian American themed stories on stages other than the, quote, specific Asian American theater companies. And that was something that gradually began to change. And it's, as of right now, it's sort of interesting in that how much of American theater has Asian American themed works being produced. I think the New York Times came out with an article just as COVID hit that the theaters in New York or around the country were going to feature plays by Asian American playwrights all over the country and in New York just before the COVID hit. And that it's interesting how, one, that Asian American theater had so kind of grown in terms of its acceptance and interest, though COVID-19 sort of stopped that all. But it kind of shows the journey of where some things began and how they've grown and moved and morphed and developed into other things. But I attribute it all again to being around at a certain particular point in time in history that I was able to participate in, that actually gave me my voice and my opportunity.
Since you brought it up, we haven't met, it was refreshing not to talk about COVID-19 for a good half an hour, but you did bring it up. So I have to ask, how has this affected your creative life? I mean, obviously, performances, productions are on hold now, but have you found that this is a good time for writing, for creativity? I'm sure you heard the story about Shakespeare writing King Lear. If one more person tells me that story, I'll pull my hair out. But anyway, what's your experience been in the last 6-7 months in terms of productivity, in terms of creativity?
Well, initially I couldn't write. And it had to do with the fact that in addition to COVID-19, there's Black Lives Matter, there is Trump, there was so much, and this I don't have to talk about because you and everyone is aware of, so much social turmoil And for me, the idea of the things I used to talk about, the things that came out of me, weren't fitting in to all that was going on, or there was an inkling of fitting in. But I just sat there for months and months just trying to figure it out, knowing that I didn't know what to say. I didn't understand all that was going on. I don't think that's unique at all. And so I basically just sat there and was just kind of watching in both horror and just fascinated by all that's going on, all that I was feeling, but I didn't know in any way how to articulate that in any kind of artistic form. And then more recently, I started to, it allowed me also to really pursue my interest in working with composers. So that's one thing that I began to do, which allowed me, again, kind of to pivot a bit and also perhaps do something that felt in some way authentic to me, and that it was in some way not a ignoring of all that was happening in social conditions, because that also would have felt odd. Mm-hmm. So one is I began working with a small theater called, it was called Ubuntu, Theater Ubuntu, and it's now called the Oakland Theater Project. Michael Moran. And they were a young upstart company that I met Michael and we began talking. We would meet for hours and just talk about the world. And I met somebody that's like 40 years my junior, who we just hit it off. So I began doing plays with them. And then I also met two composers, Shinji Eshima, who's a local composer, and he's the contrabassist with the SF Ballet Orchestra. But he is kind of came to composing late, but he's perhaps most well known for doing the musical score to Raku, which was a piece done about 5 years ago at the SF Ballet, featuring Huan. But he composed the score for that at the SF Ballet, I'm sorry if I said opera, ballet. And it was, I heard the music and I was just blown away. Turns out, he's local. He's a Japanese American who grew up in Berkeley. And he's around my age, younger, but my age. And I thought, this is somebody I have to work with. And so we've been chatting and working on things. And then I met this rather fascinating guy who's living locally in the Bay Area named David Coulter. Now, David Coulter is a multi-instrumentalist who is from England, but has worked with a variety of really fascinating folks. His main instrument is a musical saw, but he used to be in a band called the Pogues. Some of you are aware of some of these bands, but he's worked a lot with some of these names, Ryan Eno, Marion Faithfull, Tom Waits, he's worked a great deal with, but he plays his approaches, and we've just been talking and trying to do things. He uses everything. It's like stick things to bang on. And so just chatting with David, who lives nearby here, has allowed my mind to kind of expand during this whole period of all that's going on. And so we've been trying to collaborate. And that again has afforded me an entree into the world, into myself, any kind of expression. But again, it's with somebody whom I would have never thought I could really work with. But again, it's part of how one tries to keep oneself alive artistically in these very peculiar times. And so that's what I'm doing now, working with people like David Coulter, Shinji Eshima, and Michael Moran, this very small theater company that's very mixed. It's got, in terms of like racially, it's just a very comfortable, as it were, mix of peoples. So that's where it's kind of led me to now.
So collaboration keeps coming up again and again. I mean, obviously theater is a collaborative art, certainly opera, film. Do you need collaboration? You, Philip Gotonda, need collaboration to create? Are you satisfied just working on your own? Could you write a novel? Could you write poems? Or do you need that interaction with other artists?
I think in the truest sense, no, I don't. In the truest sense, I've always done stuff just out of my own head. And it's rather bringing in people after I've created the thing to bring in people to work with me. In the last part of my career, though, I found that it's important to have other people collaborate, really in part of the creation of it, as opposed to me having it done already and then bringing it to people. My films were like that. Even my early music was always, I've written the song, David, let's go out on the road and work together on this as performing it. And he's rather not many people know that David is a fabulous violinist, jazz violinist. Of course, you wouldn't know that. He just, but he is. And so, but now of late, for example, with Shinji Eshima and David Coulter, and even Michael Moran at Ubuntu, it's all about kind of really sitting down and talking with the artist right from the beginning and really trying to, as best as possible, kind of open my mind and really allowing whatever comes out of me to be shaped and transformed by this other spirit. And that feels really hard. I have to kind of actually consciously work on that, not to reject it and say, I have to do it my way. And it's, again, I don't know where it's going to lead to. It has a lot to do with like stepping off the cliff and there's the unknown, but you have enough equipment on, sort of semi-feathered, that you believe that I can, as it were, pass over this chasm, or that a landmass will appear that will catch my foot as I step across, because I've done my homework here and extrapolated out. And so whatever it is I create, fact is meant to be as part of this landmass that came forward. So.
Back to your process, you mentioned Ubuntu Theater, and I came across an interview that you did with Sam Herwick of the San Jose Mercury News about Pool of Unknown Wonders.
Yeah.
And you said, you were talking about this particular piece, you said, this is one where I had the story kicking around in me, the basic storyline for years. It was just one of those things that float up in my head and I'll start to work a bit and then they go away and then I'll keep coming back to them. And then 15 years down the road, they finally surface and become a play. Is that a typical story? Is that a typical story of one of your plays? Do they sit with you for a while?
Yes, it is. I didn't realize that was in fact happening initially, but I think what happens is, I get an idea and then I can't take it any further than just a little down the road, but that it sits inside of me and literally they kind of gather like clothing and flesh inside of me as the years tumble on, until finally it somehow on some other level has developed its kind of fully fleshed out form, and then it tumbles out of me. Even then it's kind of difficult, but I do know that I sit on stories for years and years before they emerge. And it's one of these things where I acknowledge now that, if you're a writer, and I'm sure all artists do this, you literally are not always present. That there's a part of you below the surface that is continually working on stories and something, and that it means that you're not always present. It's a choice. You just make a choice and develop this way of living. And I know definitely that's true with myself, that I'm not always here. And it's always bothered Diane, my wife, who's also an artist and novelist. But it just means you're not always present, and that below the surface, your soul is working on these stories, turning them over, shifting, throwing them back and forth until finally, in some form, they're ready to emerge. And, I'll sit on plays. I Dream of Chang and Eng, I had been working on for like 25 years. I remember one play I was commissioned by South Coast Rep in LA. It was called Ballad of Yachio. And that for a while that I had the record for the longest outstanding commission, because it was like 6 or 7 years in the making. And but they were patient, and then also I began to understand my process. So they do sit around inside of me a long time.
So when you said they emerge, do you just know that you're ready to sit down and write? Do you ever check and see, lift up the cover and see if it's ready? Nope, not ready yet. Have to go back to it. How does it come out? How do you know when it's time to write that piece?
I organically go back to it periodically. And I tell this to my students too, when you're writing, at least I can tell as words come out of me and the story is being told, whether it feels, and I call it thick, that has a thickness to it. It's as if it's part of a root system, it comes from someplace. It's not arbitrary. To me, the idea of if it's arbitrary, that's not going to work because it comes from nowhere and it doesn't fit into a kind of a whole base, subterranean architecture. So for me, the idea is, it has to feel, again, thick as it comes out of me and not light and arbitrary. And as it does, then I kind of know this is from somewhere that's a part of this bigger kind of architecture structure and that I could sit with and keep working on it. And that thickness tells me that it's right. I'm on course. But it's a sense, and I don't know how to tell. I tell my students again, it's a thickness.
I like that, a thickness. Do you work on more than one project at a time? I mean, if one's not thick enough, or can you go to another one that's thicker?
Yeah, I mean, I'm continuously working on multiple projects. Some are, commissioned or outstanding. Others are just things that interested me and I'm interested in doing. So multiple projects all the time. One is I think it's artistically the way one works, at least I do. And then also practically that if you're going to survive at this field, you have to have many projects in different stages so that realistically you'll have productions happening that allow your career to move forward.
About your writing rituals, do you write every day?
I used to. And what I would do is I can only write after I've gotten up. So I get up in the morning and I get my espresso. Before I've talked to anybody, engage the world, I just sit down and begin working. And it can last for 20 minutes and it can last for 8 hours. But I think a lot of writers are like this. You plunk yourself down. I haven't engaged the world and I have my espressos and it kind of jump starts me. And this particular ritual is what I do. And I used to do it early in my career in coffee houses all over San Francisco. There were favorite ones I had because it's got a lot of what I call white noise, ambient noise. And if they know you and like you, they leave you alone at the coffee house. And there's just enough distraction that you aren't really conscious that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. So I don't do that anymore. I just do it at home, but that's part of the ritual. But it has to be, I can't have engaged the world yet. If I start just doing business, that pipeline shuts off. So I'm not sure why. So if I take a nap and wake up, then again, it's sort of that pipeline is a little more open again. But the moment I begin to engage the world on too much, it changes the pipeline and the muscle. It could be a creative muscle that I'm using, like if you work dramatic, you're directing something, it's a different muscle, but it's not the creative one I used to write.
And how did you find this? How did you find out that you needed to do it first thing in the morning before you've engaged the world? Was it trial and error? Did you sit down sometimes after dealing with things and it just wasn't there? The well was empty?
Yeah, or rather not the well empty. It's just whatever that pipeline is, it's clogged. It's like it's just not open. And again, it gets back to the sense of feeling things feeling thick as they come out of you, as opposed to trying to make up stuff in an arbitrary fashion coming from outside, plunking it down and knowing that it could have been any word, any phrase there, any line, and that it's not connected to anything. So it's a kind of a matter of getting up in the morning and realizing this is the best time to always feel that kind of sense.
So it's not so much that you're a morning writer, it's for when you get up that you need to jump in there and let the pipeline open. So I assume you don't, unless you're writing for 16 hours, you're not a typical night writer. Some people like to write at night, not you.
We keep really late hours and we're not sure why this happened, but if we can go from going to sleep at 5 in the morning to 2 in the morning to 1, but we don't work at night. Neither of us do. I certainly don't. My mind is too tired and kind of like beaten up by the end of the day. So it has to be whenever I've gotten up from sleeping. So usually, no, it's more like 11 o'clock or so until I started teaching. And now they forced me to get up earlier than that. So.
Yes, we will get to teaching. I asked my students to contribute some questions, and they wanted to know, does writing come easily to you, and has it always come easily to you?
Well, I do know, and I think this is true of a lot of people who are involved in the arts. Since I was little, I always had this aspect to my character which wanted to create things. It wasn't writing, or I, used to write a little bit, but it was more like music, painting. I was even as a young kid trying to do clothing design. At oddest thing, I would design things, and my mother would sew them, and I'd wear these shirts that were kind of outlandish. But it is something I always had. I didn't always write, and I certainly didn't always write plays, as I've indicated. But certainly there's a part of my character that's always been there that isn't in my other brothers. And for whatever reason, it's in me, and I've always sensed it, and I've always kind of fed it in various ways. So writing itself, though, is hard. Again, I will say that it's, in the end, it's kind of a craft. So you have the creative muse, but it has to have gone through a kind of, well, this is part of the writing journey. You have kind of native instinct, it just flows out. And sometimes when you're first beginning, that's just that kind of throwing out there of that stuff works. But at some point you have to know how to, as it were, steward it along. And that takes a lot of work, and that's kind of painful. I remember Sam Shepard influenced me a great deal. And he's not every, I think that's part of a later generation that was influenced by Sam Shepard. But I remember him saying early on, he would ride the horse. He would just jump on the horse and it would just take off. And if you look at Sam Shepard's early works, some of his monologues and plays are so mysterious. They just flow, and they're these extraordinary, elegant kind of journeys, but they don't necessarily go anywhere. And then later he said he began to figure out that there was a craft to playwriting, and that's when he began to write Curse of the Starving Class, and then ultimately, what really represents that is Very Child, which has a really nice structure to it. It's very kind of classic. And so again, one can argue as to what is in the end the best work, but it shows you this idea that you can initially just have this creative force, but that at some point you also begin to realize that there's a way you can craft it and shape it so that ultimately in this fuller form, it has more power, it's more accessible, and that it has deeper roots, whether you choose to go with it or not. So writing is hard. It's difficult.
Now that you don't go to coffee houses, do you have a space in your home where you write? Do you have a set place where you work all the time? That's your studio, your space?
I do, but it moves. We used to live in Glen Park in San Francisco, and we happened to buy this huge Victorian that was kind of like the Addams Family house in Glen Park, still there. And I would move from room to room. I would fill it up with all kinds of stuff. And then I'd move to the next room. And there came a point where I used up all the rooms in my wife's head. You have to figure out where it is you're going to work and make that your office. And I never learned that. So I kind of move around each house. We're in a new house now in the Berkeley Hills, and I move around. I do believe there is this thing of, there are kind of areas that, whether it's the soil and earth itself, or the way that the structure is in a kind of a feng shui way, that are more powerful, or actually just feel more comfortable to work. And so I notice I'll gravitate to certain areas and certain rooms, and that they, for whatever reason, feel more comfortable to work. I do think, though, I like caves. I'm sort of the opposite of some folks. I don't like a lot of light, and my druthers would be to work in more cave-like environments, and that feeds me the best.
I'm the same way. My wife always wants all the lights on, and I don't like that. I just feel like I'm not comfortable in all that light. So on to teaching, and then I want to get to questions from the audience soon. Now that you are a teacher, you're a full-time professor, has that affected your writing process? Do you have less time to write? Are you able to write when you're teaching during the semester? Has that interfered? I don't want to say interfered. Has that changed at all your writing rituals?
Well, I would say it actively interferes. It actively interferes.
You said it. Okay.
I said it, and it's one of these things where even at Berkeley, I was hired and brought on as an artist, a practicing artist, but departments, and my department is one of the most collegial, comfortable, and environments one could be in at a department, because I've heard horror stories. I do find there's just so much administrative work that I am required to do that in the end, something has to suffer. And I certainly can't sort of shortchange your students. They're live, they're in front of you. But you can't work creatively the way you used to work. That's certainly, for me, that's the case. So it definitely, something suffers, and it really interferes. Teaching, in particular, the administrative work, just is so consuming of your your mind, that it's very, very difficult to keep doing creative work. And in universities sometimes don't acknowledge that, or can't acknowledge that, because they also have to keep functioning. And so you're required to do things, write reports, sit on committees, and contribute, even in a department as theater, dance, performance studies, which again is one of the most comfortable and supportive environments you can be in.
But in your classroom, when you're with your students, what are your expectations when your students enter your classrooms? Do you expect them to have a baseline knowledge of dramatic writing? Talk a little bit about your own playwriting classroom.
Well, it continues to change over the years, but initially, what it is I keep it small, so it's more of a seminar fashion, and you have to submit writing, some form of fiction writing, up to 5 pages. It can be anything. This has to be fiction. And then I take a look at that, and basically it's kind of a blind, it's like musicians when you audition, you're behind a curtain. I have names, but beyond that, I don't know who they are or their backgrounds. And I choose students purely based on that. And what it is, again, is the idea of, in the writing, that I find something kind of thick, that has some kind of soulfulness to it. I guess a personal taste, because plays can be anything, and aesthetically, thematically be anything. But for me, that's what I look for. And so they enter into the class, and everyone has different backgrounds as far as writing. And so I used to teach it until about last year, that I would basically go through the whole thing of craft and finding one's personal voice. Again, this idea that every one of you has a specific story. What is it? Tell me, be able to articulate it, investigate yourself. And that with it, as it comes out, it needs to be in some kind of form. And so let's find the voice, the story, and then we'll see what it fits into. Is it because some things come out are more, they're kind of installation, they're site specific, they're immersive now, they're to some degree even kind of devised. And so I'm trying to serve each student's story. But most recently, I changed, because I realized some classes, like the one I have now, everyone can write. And so I decided I don't even have to talk about craft or whatnot. Let's just hear what your story is, and then we'll go from there. And we'll just, if any of the craft stuff comes up, I'll bring it in. But it seems as if they already have a way of voicing the story. So let's just travel with it. So for this semester in particular, they're just writing, and I don't lecture much about form or content or craft. It comes up, but it's just, what's your story? And let's hear it, and let's read it in class.
That's great. I want to ask you a little bit about reading, but I also want to let the audience know if you do have questions, you can type them into the chat and then I will read them aloud and we'll get through as many as we can. So we're always telling our students in the college writing programs that in order to write, you need to read. The two are interlinked. So I want to ask you, Philip, what do you read? What book is on your bedside table right now, if that's where your book is? But what do you read?
You know, it's almost as if right now I'm not reading, and particularly since the COVID-19 thing has emerged. You know, I get a lot of my information from other sources. Uh, when I do read, you know, I read a combination of literature or plays in particular. I try to keep up on all the new playwrights, and usually I read them, you know, so it's very much that. And then with COVID-19, what's happened is, again, it gets back to what am I writing now? Or in terms of initial writing again, you know, it's also plays, and then I'll come across really interesting articles, such as there was a book called Politics of Piety. It's an example of one, written by a woman named Saba Mahmood at UC Berkeley, who has since passed away, but it was such an intriguing kind of, she went back to the Middle East where she grew up and examined roles of women. And but that's an example of something along those lines where it's kind of has political, social kind of content along with reading my plays. And then more recently, and that's an older book, but it's one that's kind of really stuck to me, I haven't been able to read or want to read anything. I haven't been able to even watch any kind of television or any kind of media, just the news. We just watch the news, but everything else seems, oddly enough, it can't come up to what is so potent that's happening in our real lives. And even if it's a kind of escapism of kind of, it feels sort of dishonest. I can't explain it, where it's like I'm wasting my time watching a thing on film or reading a book, even though it's compelling and powerful. It just feels like I'm wasting I shouldn't be doing that. I should be present. And what I'm not just present because so much is going on and swirling around. So as of right now, you know, I'm pretty much kind of sitting there watching the news with my wife and playing with our dog. And we'll do that until sort of things maybe shift a bit.
Yeah, no, I understand. I mean, it almost seems some people have checked out and they're just, you know, that they want to escape it all. But I understand what you're saying. I mean, there's so much going on now. It almost feels, I don't want to say not dishonest, but it feels like I'm not really being true to what I need to be doing when there's so much going on.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn to we have a lot of questions here. I'm going to just pick out some. So we have a question. How do you think multilingualism and the lack of it play a role in the creation of genuine dialogue and emotional expressions in Asian American theater?
Well, you know, my posture on that, and certainly kind of the attitude towards that, has kind of changed over the years. When I first started writing, you know, there was this challenge of, and David Henry Wong had the same problem of, in my home, there was a combination of Japanese and English that was spoken. So how does that translate to writing a play that in some way replicates authenticity in the household? And, you know, I found early on that if I used a Japanese word, even if I put it in context, it wouldn't land. And so as a consequence, I would say the word, and then they'd repeat it as if it were in parentheses. So it seemed okay, but in fact, gohan, rice, is what we're going to eat tonight. You know, it was actually a kind of compromise, as it were, to the greater public that I would kind of invite you in. Now that's changed radically over the last, you know, 30, 40 years, where now it's very much rather, I encourage my students, you know, you have to tell the story in your language too, because there's no way around it. And that the audience now has to be expected to come to it. You know, that's our responsibility now, or something great is being lost So write in your own language, and then we'll figure out how we'll contend with it if I'm part of the other to your work that doesn't understand it, and that we'll just have to figure it out, whether that's subtitles or in the program. But one shouldn't, I think at this point, try to adapt in some way for the audience to get what, in fact, when adapting, you lose the kind of the realness of the world. So it's really morphed, from trying to actually help the audience to now, in terms of my students, you should write in the language in which the story kind of comes to you. And then we'll figure out after that how to contend with it. And that kind of a related story is my plays have been translated and performed in Japan. And I experienced something when one of my plays was done in Tokyo, Sisters Matsumoto, it was called, but it was translated and performed at this really nice theater called the Minge Gekidan did it. And it's one of the big formal traditional theaters in Japan for contemporary work. But when I sat in the audience, what I experienced was something I never experienced in the US. And that is a kind of sense of something would happen on stage and everyone would lean forward at the same time. Something humorous would happen and everyone would laugh at the same time. And if you're in this country and you write about with any kind of sense of specificity in cultural moments, you never experience. Everyone is experiencing the work on different levels. Some are leaning forward, some are leaning back, and we're simply a country at this point where works are gotten at so many different kind of levels, and it's so interesting to be in a country where everyone seemed to be getting the work at the same time, and we're experiencing actually the same play or closer to it, as opposed to in the States where it struck me that simply is not the case. And if you work in certain types of worlds, cultural specificity, racial, all of these aspects, people experience them, and we're well aware of it now, on different levels and with different kind of different experiences they're bringing to the table. Whether sometimes they're, again, internalized and misinformed or based on a kind of racist history. That is all part of what's going on. And it simply means that this is a different, when I do it in the States, which is where I belong, and there's home, it's a different kind of audience and it's a different kind of accessing of the material. And it's very much now kind of all on the table for discussion as to whose story it is, who should be telling the story, and what is the responsibility of the person sitting there experiencing it to make sure that they come to the material with a kind of, as it were, informed eye, and not one that's kind of internalized, basically a racist history, racist story that really is not allowing you entree into the story, the real story.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Since you mentioned audiences, there's a couple of questions about the audience. Do you have a particular audience in mind when you sit down to write a play? In other words, do you have that imagined audience that will be consuming, will be enjoying your work?
Actually, I would say that ideally, it would be a 70-year-old male man that was not and raised in the agricultural environment and then went off into the world and experienced racism and then enlightenment and then ignorance again. That, in fact, both in humor, but in truth, that person would really get the work. That's not the case. And so I would say that I sort of write just whatever comes out of me now. It's just whatever's given to me, I write. And then I don't worry about the audience. I don't worry about them. I mean, it's important, but I certainly feel like, you can't write for them. You just write for yourself.
Here's a related question. What have been audience comments and critics' reactions to your different plays and films, and has that feedback impacted you? be it audience or critics? Or, I mean, I guess they're not mutually exclusive.
No, not at all. I do remember one experience, which again told me that what the audience is seeing, it may not be what you had expected. This is a while ago, but we did Sisters Matsumoto in Boston at one of the big theaters in Boston. And it's filled with Boston audiences sometimes are like really, they're very, well-read audiences, And one of the Q&As, I remember this Phil raised his hand and said, I'm Jewish. And I saw this play and nothing happened. If it were my family, there'd be blood all over the stage. Again, coming out of the internment camps, being incarcerated, there'd be blood all over the stage. And I didn't see that. And I don't understand that. And it dawned on me. I said to him, there's blood all over the stage. I mean, for me, in terms of how I wrote the play. But, in my play, it's all unspoken. A lot of it's indirect, unspoken, because that is how that family functions. But it did make clear to me, really clear to me that, different people have different expectations or just see different works. So that was an instance of that. What was the question again was?
How you're affected by audience reaction to your work or critics' reaction. Has that impacted the way that you've written or the way that you've created?
It can't help but do that. And there are some moments where you might be critically not getting the response you'd like. But I really believe that you just, in the end, there has to be a reason that you write that's other than how the audience is going to experience it. It has to be something a little closer to who you are, your soul, that you write because it's important for you to express this and that you feel that it's, that you have to do that. So whether in the end audiences are not listening or critics do not like it, I believe you still have to move forward. And what it means is that, you sort of are doing this gesture, which may be happening in a vacuum, but you have to have faith that in some way, this gesture, this thing is important. And in the end, it was important for me that I'm going to do it and have to do it, whether people are listening or not. Now, that is not to say that again, I continually feed my body with as much current information as I have. I'm not turning my mind, closing my ears. But it does mean you have to find a reason for doing your art that's other than the critic or the audience member. You have to find a reason for that, whether you can articulate it or not. So for me, the idea is no matter what's happening critically, or even an audience response, or even if people don't want to produce my works anymore, there has to be a reason why I write and put these things outside of me that has to do with me and doesn't need that. That other stuff is part of an additional part of the information. But you have to write because you have a reason to write a story. You have to want to just tell the story, and I'll keep telling it, whether anyone is seemingly listening or not.
And on that note, as we continue to tell our own stories and have faith in our own stories, I want to thank you so much, Philip Kan Gotanda, for joining us today for Berkeley Writers at Work. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you to the audience.
Yes, thanks everyone.
Bye, John.
Bye-bye.